Greetings, Mandrake Road family. We continue our weekly discussion of Sabbath. This week we will be looking at Mark 2:23 through 28, which I will go ahead and read. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And so this scene here in Mark is actually kind of interesting. We walk through a few different scenes where Jesus forgives someone, and the scribes take issue with that. The other religious authorities take issue with that. And we kind of walk through a few different scenes like this until we get to Sabbath, which is kind of the center of Jewish community life. And it's also a bit odd because it would be strange that the Pharisees were following Jesus and the disciples through the grain fields. And so it is a bit of an interesting scene, but it culminates in where we're headed today, in this idea that the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. And this really hints at something that I think Christianity has dealt with since the very beginning. And we think of certain things as certain things in ways that makes them more about that particular thing than about God or about us as God's people and what it's intended to do. So Sunday worship would be a very close parallel. For just in the churches of Christ, this has been, for our faith tradition, has been a discussion that's been happening for decades now. And arguments have happened over how worship is supposed to look, how it's supposed to go, what we can and can't do, who can do what and who cannot do what. And we kind of create a similar situation where worship is supposed to be a time in which we invite the presence of God to dwell as we worship and commune together, and for what is a very short time during everyone's week. And so we see the Pharisees they're doing what's lawful. So basically they would be plucking grains, plucking the heads of grain, and what you'd do is you'd rub them together and you'd be able to eat that. And so that was considered possibly participating in harvest, in which we see in Torah in the Old Testament that you are not to harvest grain, you're not to reap grain on the harvest. So full on harvesting, and so that somewhere down the line there was a question of how far did that go, and that's what we see happening here with the Pharisees. And sometimes we do something similar. I have I was asked about my thoughts on a situation where when it came to women's roles, where a church allowed women to do certain things during worship but not others. And so a woman sang a song, and then at the closing of the song she prayed, and there was a big uproar by the church body of whether the prayer was okay or not. And I found myself baffled by the conversation that was taking place. And these types of things, as we see with the Pharisees, is that this misses the point of Sabbath. Sabbath is not a thing that has a hold over human beings, over creation. And it's not that creation has a hold over Sabbath, but Sabbath is there for humankind's benefit. It's not there to create more boundaries and to create more laws. It's there to benefit and facilitate a relationship between humankind and God. And that's something that, as we continue to work towards Genesis 2, we'll talk a little bit more about. But this brings me to the concept of time, and we're going to talk about this for the next couple of weeks. And this, what Jesus does here is really interesting because it changes the perspective in a way that is, it seems strange because the connection to David eating the showbread in the temple, or not in the temple, in the eating the showbread of the priests is something that doesn't immediately connect to the story as far as plucking the grains, the heads of grain on the Sabbath, and Jesus is not being chased, and it's not Jesus plucking and rubbing the heads of grain together. It's the disciples doing that. And so we do see some things where we might ask, well, how does this fit? Well, what we're seeing here is Jesus is articulating a little bit more about who he is, and that he is the one that is expected, the one from David's line. And so we see that this comes to that ultimately the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And so we see this playing out, and it doesn't, at this point in Mark, we don't have a good sense of, well, what does that even mean? We have this connection to David, we have the Son of Man, and these Old Testament references are just everywhere, and they're kind of hard to piece together. Well, the narrative will piece them together. We're not going to spend a lot of time doing that, but I think this begs the question, a question that we ask a lot, and the church has asked since Jesus came and died and rose again, is what time is it? And the Pharisees here are missing something big. The kingdom of God has come in the form of Jesus and his ministry, and they're missing it. And he tries to hint and he tries to demonstrate what that looks like. And so this is one of those where I think sometimes when it comes to our own situations, when it comes to worship or other various practices that we have, that we find ourselves missing the true nature of a thing. And that's part of what's happening here with the Pharisees. And this is a discussion that happened in first century Judaism about how much work is too much work on the Sabbath. And so we're seeing a rather strong conservative response here. But I want to think about something when it comes to time more along the lines of our daily lives. Time is something that Abraham Heschel calls the only non-renewable resource. And so once time is gone, it's gone. You can't go back to June 23rd, 2019. And once this one's gone, you can't go back to June 23rd, 2020. Not that anybody would want to travel back to 2020 after this year is over, but it is an interesting mindset to have that in mind, because then we do hear phrases in our own culture of things like time is money, and it's not untrue, right? The more hours you work, especially if you work a job that is hourly, you tend to get paid more, right? And but also If you own a business, the more effort and time you put in, the more you will more than likely get out of it. But this changes the perspective in a way that, how do we view regular moments in our day? I've talked about this before, that my schedule is planned out weekly, and I have chunks of time set aside, and I'm very guarded of that with that. And when my schedule is not going as planned, then that creates that throws my day into a tailspin. But something that I'm trying more to do and to do better is to recognize time where I can be more intentional about what it is that that I'm doing to reflect Sabbath. And so meals are one of those things. Meals are a big part of ministry in general, not just by meeting with people, but we practice a meal every Monday or every Sunday where we do communion, and so where we remember the Last Supper and remember the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so as I have meals with people in ministry, also as I go out into the week, is I don't typically plan for a certain amount of time for that to take place. I let the person I'm meeting typically dictate that time. There are times when I have several meetings, and so I do have to go from place to place, and so sometimes I do have to set those boundaries. I try not to do that, but it doesn't always work that way. But but one of the things I grew up, early in my childhood, we had dinner at the dinner table every night. And later on that became less and less. And so now I practice the latter at my own house. And as getting ready to welcome baby T-Rex, I'm really trying to rethink that and rethink the opportunity for dinner to be something where, or breakfast or whatever, a time that allows us to reflect Sabbath, where it's a time of intentionality instead of what's the purpose, to feel our bodies and to do so we can do what we need to do for the rest of the night and then the next day. Instead, to think about it as a time that I get to connect with my wife and get to spend time with my child when that time comes. And the same goes later on. I have a former professor and friend who talked about having children, and one child was trying to get his attention. And he ultimately said, well, after reflecting on that time, he ended up missing that opportunity. And so, and he lamented that on social media, and the comment was, for many people, welcome to parenthood. And so Sabbath, in thinking about time, helps us to be more intentional. So Sabbath is not something where, so when I practice Sabbath, which is on Mondays, I tend not to try to plan too much as far as schedule goes. I usually have an appointment or something, whatever it is, because I plan various appointments around the days that I'm not working, but at the same time, when I have time with Katie, I try not to let that be dictated by, well, I need to be doing this or I need to be doing that. Instead, I let, however long that might take, I just let it happen instead of worrying about exactly how much time is being used, and just as a chance to connect and not be worried about work or school or anything else, even housework, which I do on the Sabbath, but only as needed. And so those are the types of things that I'm thinking about as time. Time is something that tends to be, as we think about it, as Abraham Heschel said, a resource. Sometimes we think of it in terms of of something that is that we have to maximize. And I think Sabbath really pushes back against that idea. And I think that's exactly what Heschel is getting at, is that it's, as a non-renewable resource, is that just because we're producing does not, when it comes to work, does not mean that we are necessarily doing better. And so one of the things I encourage, and I know someone at Mandrake practices this, but Sabbath always begins with a meal. So the sun goes down on Friday, and you have what's called a Shabbat meal. And so I encourage you to just not to start a 24-hour period of Sabbath, but to just have what you would call a Shabbat meal, where there's no set time for when it starts. You sit down and you have no intention of moving beyond the opportunity to spend time with family or friends. And right now that's going to be difficult for some, but if you have people that you can do that with, I encourage you to try and do that. And however long it takes is fine. There's no, put your phones away, take the clocks off the wall, and just let whatever come. Whatever happens. Wherever the conversation goes, it goes. But take that time to really invest in what's in front of you. And so we'll talk a little bit more specifically about, we'll talk about a little bit more about Abraham Heschel's idea of time next week. But the whole idea here is that we don't want to miss the opportunities and things that are in front of us because we're so focused on what in this case would be a minor. Jesus is not practicing Sabbath. The disciples are not practicing Sabbath. The Pharisees are so caught up in trying to make sure that Sabbath is practiced as an exact science that they're missing the point of Sabbath. And the same thing goes for us, that our time of worship or our time of gathering together at various points, or just our time of having conversation with people, sometimes takes on this, that we have to always be doing it as an exact science, that we have to do it in a certain way, or we have to touch certain points or do certain things during that time. And that's not at all what is meant by this. And so I think that's where we don't want to find ourselves in that position as well. And we don't want to become slaves to that thing. And often that creates a lot of unnecessary anxiety and struggle in communities. And so I hope as we think about time and we think about Sabbath as being something made for human beings, that we can start to reflect more on how Sabbath is something that we do in relationship with God and relationship with each other, and not something that is just a divine mandate. And so next week we'll be looking at one of my favorite stories. We'll be looking at Luke 13:10-17, the woman who's been doubled over for 18 years, as Jesus heals her on the Sabbath. But I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you later.